There's a field within philosophy, and more specifically epistemology, called the philosophy of science. And what that field is about is explaining what it is that is special about the scientific method and how it is able to produce reliable representations of reality. Why is it that science has been able to generate such an accurate description of reality that we've been allowed to produce incredible technology, whereas thousands of years of philosophy have turned up virtually no positive results? What is it about science that makes it different from pseudoscience, and what is it that makes it different from non-science? Well, it kind of turns out with a lot of these different theorists in the 20th century, particularly people like Thomas Kuhn, Karl Popper, Paul Feyerabend, philosophers of science. None of them really came to a consensus about what is special about science. They all took different tactics. They tried to come up with theoretical descriptions of what in the abstract made science different, but no one could do it. And then Thomas Kuhn came along and he said, well, let's look at the actual history and let's see what prominent scientists have done. What's their method been like? And then he looked at Galileo and Newton. And he didn't find a whole lot of what he expected to find. He didn't find that much experimentation, for instance. He found a whole lot of thought experiments. The thought experiments have been, the foundation of philosophy since the Greeks. So none of these philosophers of science were really able to put their finger on what it is that makes science different. And even plenty of them, well, not plenty, sorry, I can't quite remember the name of the particular theorist I have in mind here, but he supposed that maybe the thing that distinguished science from other disciplines was the social structure, and by that I mean the set of rules that the scientific community engages in. There's a certain set of social standards that generates the higher quality, more rigorous, distinctly scientific material. And that would be, for instance, something like peer review. That's a social interaction which creates motivations which are very different to the motivations of a religious speaker or scholar, for instance. But anyway, none of them were able to create any kind of cohesive description of science and what made it different from pseudoscience and non-science. And what happened then was they all kind of looked at themselves, or at least ought to have looked at themselves and thought, well, this is on us, because we can't deny the accomplishment of a Newton or a Galileo or an Einstein. The whole contribution of a Popper or a Kuhn or a Feyerabend is to explain what makes a Newton great or a Galileo great, and they've failed at their one job. So, to the extent that the philosophy of science has not been able to create a theory which describes and distinguishes science from other forms of knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, just because philosophy of science has failed to wrap up in a neat little package what makes science different from non-science, that doesn't make science invalid. So there's a certain humility that the philosophers of science ought to take, and I think they generally do, which is that they are unable to describe the difference that they set out to describe, and then they acknowledge failure. Now, the reason I mention this is that there is a particular school where it's a school, you might call it a set of epistemological theories, and its goal was to explain how language represents reality. Its goal was to explain, in the same way that the philosopher of science explained what made science different to non-science. It was an attempt to describe what made a good sentence different from a bad sentence. How can we distinguish these things? And they failed, in the same way that the philosophers of science failed. But they took a different conclusion than the philosophers of science. Because instead of recognizing their own failure to describe what it is that allows language to convey meaning, which is the thing that they'd sought out to describe, just because they failed, they decided that there was no meaning to the language, which is frankly absurd, because we all experience meaning in language. It would be as though the philosopher of science were to conclude, because he can't find what makes science special, that science isn't special, and science isn't distinct. But you can't deny the reality of technological marvels. They're just facts. And in the same way, you can't deny the reality that humans communicate information to each other. And there has to be some way that information can make sense. And if you can't create a theory of language which allows for information to exist, then your theory of language is insufficient, because information self-evidently exists.